The wooden beam cracks like a gunshot. Thomas Fariner jolts awake in the blackness of his bedroom, disoriented, his lungs burning with something heavier than sleep. Smoke curls beneath the doorframe, thick, acrid, alive. Downstairs, in the bakehouse on Pudding Lane, the ovens he banked hours ago have betrayed him. Embers, he will later insist, just embers left smouldering in the grate. But London in September 1666 does not care about his intentions. The city has been waiting all summer for this moment, though no one knew it. 8 months without meaningful rain. Timber-framed houses leaning into narrow alleys like drunken conspirators, warehouses stuffed with tar, oil, spirits and tallow pressed against the riverfront. Fariner scrambles through the window onto the neighbouring roof tile, dragging his daughter behind him. His maidservant, too frightened or too slow, does not follow. She becomes the first. Below them, orange light spills into the lane, and the wind, God, the wind, comes gusting from the east like breath through a bellows. Within an hour, 300 houses are burning. Within 3 days, 13,000. The fire moves faster than men can run, faster than buckets can be passed, faster than prayers can be whispered. It devours the medieval city whole, erasing 1,000 years of history in 72 hours of roaring heat. When the flames finally die, 85% of the city within the ancient Roman walls has been reduced to ash and rubble. 87 parish churches are gone, 13,000 homes, the Royal Exchange, the Guildhall, the Custom House, all obliterated. And yet somehow only 6 deaths are officially recorded. 6. In a city of perhaps 80,000 souls. The number is, of course, absurd. But here is the deeper question, the one that echoes across centuries. How does a city that has just watched itself burn to the ground decide what to become next? How do you rebuild not just streets and houses, but trust, order, and the very idea of urban life itself? London, before the fire, was a city of contradictions, simultaneously magnificent and miserable, ancient and ambitious, overcrowded yet expanding with unstoppable confidence. Since the restoration of Charles II in 1660, the capital had been intoxicated with renewal. The dark years of Cromwell's Puritan Commonwealth were over. Theatres reopened, music returned to the streets. The king himself walked among his subjects with a casualness that would have horrified his executed father. This was a city convinced it had survived the worst. The Great Plague had torn through these same streets just 1 year earlier, killing perhaps 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of the population. Mass graves in Finsbury Fields still held the forgotten dead. Yet by summer 1666, commerce had resumed. Ships crowded the Thames wharves. Merchants reopened their shops. Life, as Londoners understood it, had returned to its proper rhythm. The city's physical form had remained essentially unchanged since the Middle Ages. Most buildings stood 3 or 4 stories tall, their upper floors jutting over the streets in an architectural style called jettying, creating shadowed corridors where neighbours could nearly touch hands across the thoroughfare. These structures were built almost entirely of timber. Oak frames, elm planks, pine shingles. Stone was expensive, reserved for churches and the homes of the wealthy. Even the Lord Mayor lived in a timber house. The streets themselves followed no rational plan. They had evolved organically over centuries, curving and branching according to property disputes, ancient footpaths, and the whims of long-dead builders. Some lanes were barely wide enough for a cart. Sanitation existed only in theory. Chamber pots were emptied from upper windows with a shouted warning. Butchers dumped offal into the streets. The Fleet River, which ran through the city's western edge, had become an open sewer, choked with refuse and the waste of countless workshops. Yet Londoners wore their city's chaos like a badge of identity. This was the largest city in England, the beating heart of trade, politics and culture. Nearly 500,000 people, perhaps more, crowded within and around the ancient walls. Wealth, flowed through the custom house. Ideas circulated in the coffee houses of Exchange Alley. Samuel Pepys kept his famous diary. Christopher Wren designed buildings. Robert Hooke peered through microscopes at invisible worlds. This was London at the height of its confident disorder, a medieval city trying to contain the ambitions of a nascent empire, unaware that everything was about to change. The decision to the Great Fire was not an accident of fate, but the inevitable conclusion of a city that had built itself into a tinderbox. Every structural choice, every compromise of convenience over safety, every failure of urban planning had been accumulating combustible potential for generations. The architecture itself was the primary accelerant. Timber construction dominated not because Londoners were foolish, but because it was practical and economical. Oak and elm could be worked quickly by skilled carpenters. Buildings could rise in weeks rather than months. When structures needed repair or expansion, timber allowed flexibility that stone did not. But these wooden houses shared walls, creating continuous combustible pathways through entire neighborhoods. Fire could leap from building to building without ever touching the street. The practice of jettying, extending upper floors beyond the ground level, meant that structures on opposite sides of narrow lanes nearly touched, creating bridges of kindling that fire exploited with terrible efficiency. The summer of 1666 had been exceptionally dry. Meteorological records, primitive as they were, suggest England experienced one of the driest periods in decades. Timber that might normally contain some moisture had been baking in the sun for months. The wood became not just flammable, but explosively so. The city's storage practices compounded the danger exponentially. Warehouses along Thames Street contained materials essential to maritime trade and daily commerce. Pitch and tar for ship maintenance, tallow for candles, oils for lamps, timber for construction, coal for heating, gunpowder for defense. These warehouses stood shoulder to shoulder, their contents representing concentrated chemical energy waiting for ignition. London's water infrastructure was inadequate even in normal circumstances. The city relied on the Thames, on a few public conduits fed by springs outside the walls, and on wells of questionable purity. There was no organized fire service. When flames appeared, citizens formed bucket brigades, human chains passing leather buckets hand to hand from water source to fire. The system worked for small blazes in single buildings. It had no capacity whatsoever to address a conflagration moving at running speed through densely packed neighborhoods. The one tool that might have stopped the fire, creating fire breaks by demolishing buildings in the flames' path, required decisive action and legal authority. Property rights were sacred. Destroying a man's house, even to save 100 others, meant financial ruin for the owner and potential legal consequences for whoever gave the order. Lord Mayor Thomas Bloodworth, roused from sleep that first night and urged to authorize demolitions, reportedly dismissed the fire as trivial. A woman might piss it out. His hesitation would cost the city everything. Lo! By dawn on Sunday, September 2nd, 300 houses were already lost. The flames had spread from Pudding Lane to Fish Street Hill, racing toward the warehouses along the Thames. When the fire reached those storage buildings packed with combustible materials, the blaze transformed from disaster into cataclysm. Barrels of oil exploded. Tar ignited in fountains of black flame. The heat became so intense that it created its own weather system, a firestorm with winds powerful enough to tear burning shingles from roofs and hurl them hundreds of feet ahead, starting new fires faster than any bucket brigade could respond. The stone of St. Paul's Cathedral, that ancient symbol of London's permanence, began to crack from thermal stress. Lead from the roof melted and ran through the streets in molten rivers. The medieval structure, which had survived Viking raids and the Wars of the Roses, could not survive this. By Monday, panic had replaced organized response. Londoners abandoned the effort to save their city and focused on saving themselves. Carts and wagons clogged every route leading away from the flames, piled high with hastily gathered possessions. The wealthy paid extortionate prices for transportation. The poor carried what they could on their backs or dragged it in barrows. Samuel Pepys buried his wine and his Parmesan cheese in his garden, a detail that seems almost comical until you understand it as the desperate calculation of a man trying to preserve anything of value from total annihilation. The River Thames became choked with boats as thousands sought escape by water. Prices for river transport inflated by the hour. People who had lived their entire lives within the city walls now camped in the fields of Moorfields and Islington, watching the sky turn orange and black. King Charles II himself took command when civilian authority collapsed. He rode through burning streets, organizing firefighting efforts, ordering the creation of fire breaks, and even joining demolition crews with his brother James. The spectacle of royalty working alongside commoners carried symbolic weight, but it could not overcome the fundamental problem. The fire had grown beyond any human capacity to control it. Tuesday brought the fire's deepest penetration into the city's heart. The Guildhall, centre of municipal government for centuries, was gutted. The Royal Exchange, where merchants conducted international trade, collapsed into rubble. Entire parishes, communities that had existed since Saxon times, ceased to exist in any physical sense. Only on Wednesday did the wind finally shift and weaken, allowing exhausted firefighters to establish effective fire breaks using gunpowder to demolish buildings ahead of the flames. By Thursday morning, September 6th, the Great Fire had burned itself out, leaving behind a landscape that resembled the aftermath of war more than the capital of England. In the immediate aftermath, London existed in a state of collective shock that manifested not as silence, but as desperate motion. 80,000 people or more had been rendered homeless in less than a week. They congregated in temporary encampments outside the city walls, in Moorfields, in Islington, in Highgate, living under makeshift shelters constructed from salvaged materials. These refugee settlements stretched across the landscape, visible reminders that England's greatest city had effectively ceased to function. The social order, already strained, threatened to fracture completely. Merchants who had lost everything mingled with labourers who possessed even less. Class distinctions that had seemed natural and permanent suddenly felt arbitrary when everyone slept under canvas and cooked over open fires. King Charles, recognizing the political danger, ordered that markets be established in the displaced camps and that bread be provided to prevent starvation. The gesture was both humanitarian and pragmatic. Hungry refugees could become angry mobs. The search for culprits began almost immediately. Londoners needed someone to blame, some explanation that made sense of the senseless. Rumours spread that Catholic agents had started the fire as part of a papal conspiracy. A French watchmaker named Robert Hubert confessed to starting the blaze, though his story contained obvious impossibilities and he appeared mentally disturbed. He was hanged anyway. The monument, erected years later to commemorate the fire, would carry an inscription blaming Catholic treachery, a lie literally set in stone, not removed until 1831. The truth that the fire resulted from accident, poor planning, and unfortunate circumstances satisfied no one's need for meaning. Beyond scapegoating, Londoners faced crushing practical realities. Property ownership became a legal nightmare. When every landmark had burned and most property records had been destroyed with the Guildhall, how could anyone prove what they had owned? Competing claims proliferated. Men who had been neighbours for decades now disputed boundaries that no longer physically existed. The rebuilding could not begin until these fundamental questions of ownership were resolved. Daily life had to be improvised. Without homes, people conducted business from tents. Without shops, commerce moved to makeshift stalls. The sophisticated urban economy that had made London a European powerhouse had been replaced overnight by something closer to a medieval fair. Craftsmen set up workshops in fields. Lawyers conducted consultations under trees. The apparatus of civilization continued, but in ghostly, provisional forms. Psychologically, the trauma manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. Many refused to return to the burned districts even when rebuilding began, haunted by memories of the flames. Others threw themselves into reconstruction with manic energy, as if constant labor could erase what they had witnessed. Pepys recorded nightmares about fire for months afterward. The collective psyche of London had been marked by an experience that exceeded the capacity of most individuals to fully process. The city had watched itself die and now had to decide whether and how to be reborn. It would be just when the London that rose from the ashes was not the London that had burned. The Great Fire destroyed a medieval city and forced the creation of something unprecedented, a modern metropolis built according to rational principles rather than accumulated accident. The transformation began with legislation. Within months, Parliament passed the Rebuilding Act of 1667, which represented one of the first comprehensive urban planning laws in English history. The Act mandated that all new buildings be constructed of brick or stone. Timber, which had served Londoners for centuries, was now forbidden for exterior walls in the rebuilt areas. Streets were to be widened and straightened. Building heights were regulated according to street width, creating visual harmony and reducing fire risk. Property owners were required to rebuild within 3 years or forfeit their land rights, a revolutionary erosion of traditional property protections justified by civic necessity. Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke submitted ambitious plans to completely redesign the city, with broad boulevards radiating from central plazas, a rational grid that would have rivaled anything in Europe. These visions proved too radical. Property disputes, economic pressures, and conservative attachment to traditional street patterns meant that most streets followed their ancient routes. But within those familiar pathways, everything else changed. The new London was built in brick, millions upon millions of bricks, produced in kilns that sprang up around the city's perimeter. The uniform reddish-brown facades created visual coherence that the old city had never possessed. Buildings rose with classical proportions, with sash windows that became a defining feature of Georgian architecture. The cityscape became more regular, more predictable, more consciously designed. Wren's greatest achievement was not his unrealized street plan, but his churches. He designed 51 new parish churches to replace those destroyed, each one a masterpiece of Protestant Baroque architecture. Their spires punctuated the skyline, visible landmarks in a city that had lost its navigational reference points. His reconstruction of St. Paul's Cathedral, completed in 1710, gave London a dome to rival Rome's St. Peter's, a statement that Britain's capital could match continental magnificence while remaining distinctly English. But the most profound transformations were invisible. The fire destroyed the illusion that cities could simply grow organically without planning or regulation. It demonstrated that property rights, while sacred, could not be absolute when public safety was at stake. It proved that government had not just the authority, but the obligation to impose order on urban development. Fire insurance emerged as a commercial industry in the decades following the blaze. The first fire insurance company, the Fire Office, was established in 1680. Subscribers received badges to display on their buildings, and the company maintained its own firefighting brigade to protect insured properties. The experience of homelessness and social dissolution left psychological scars, but also fostered a certain democratic leveling. When everyone had lost everything, old hierarchies seemed less natural. The rebuilt city maintained class distinctions, certainly, but the shared trauma created a collective identity that transcended individual status. Londoners who lived through the fire possessed a common reference point, a before and after moment that defined their generation. Today, you can walk through the City of London and see the fire's legacy in every brick facade, in the width of streets that medieval planners never imagined, in the insurance plaques that still mark old buildings, in the monument itself, a stone column that stands exactly 202 feet tall because it stands precisely 202 feet from where Thomas Farriner's oven started everything. The Great Fire of 1666 was catastrophic, traumatic, and transformative. It revealed how quickly urban civilization could collapse when infrastructure failed and planning proved inadequate. But it also demonstrated human capacity for reinvention, for learning from disaster, for building something better from ruins. Every modern building code, every zoning law, every fire department traces its conceptual lineage back to lessons learned in those 4 terrible days. London burned so that future cities might be safer. That knowledge cost 13,000 homes, 87 churches, and lives we will never be able to count. But from those ashes rose not just a rebuilt city, but the very idea that cities could be planned, regulated, and made resilient against the forces that had destroyed their predecessors. The modern city, safe, ordered, designed, was born in the flames of medieval London's destruction. And that transformation changed not just one city, but the fundamental relationship between human beings and the urban spaces they inhabit.